Prof, there 10:30 or 10 o'clock now? You're in Brisbane, isn't it?
Yeah, 10 o'clock here.
Oh, it's in Brisbane now.
Yeah, 2 hours difference with
Oh,
Malaysia.
Prof, we shall start. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Ahmadu Rasulullah Rasul Kareem. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. And the respected guest speaker for today's webinar, and also the respected head of the Policy and Area Studies Research Unit at uh, Abdul Hamid Kulia of Islamic Field Knowledge and Human Sciences, Dr. Muir Alif, and the respected Director of Peace, Dialogue and Xenophobia Studies Center, Associate Professor Dr. Daniel Yusuf, and the respected esteemed colleagues of the Department of Political Science, and also the respected participants who have joined us with us today from all parts of the world. I warmly welcome you all to our highly anticipated special webinar on Muslim minorities, far-right extremism, threats, resistance, and resilience. Today's event is organized by Policy and Area Studies Research Unit at the Department of Political Science and Madani Studies at the International Islamic University of Malaysia, in collaboration with Peace, Dialogue, and Xenophobia Studies Center at IIUM. I am your moderator for today's session. My name is Dr. Mohammed Fawz Mohammed Zeki, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at IIUM. Actually, we are thrilled to have each and every one of you here today. So before we dive in, let me take a moment to express our gratitude for your presence. Across many parts of the world, Muslim minorities are increasingly facing the rising far-right ideologies, manifesting in hate speeches, xenophobic policies, structural discrimination, and at times violent attacks. This trend is not only reshaping the public discourse, but also deeply impacting social cohesion and citizenship rights, everyday security for millions. These forms of exclusion, citizenship rights, and everyday security for millions. So these forms of exclusion are often legitimized through populist rhetorics, securitization policies, and racialized narratives that depict Muslims as perpetual outsiders. But this is not just a story of victimhood. Around the world, Muslim communities are responding through legal challenges, civic activism, interfaith solidarity, and cultural production, community-based care, and intellectual resistance. And also youth-led movements, faith-based coalitions, digital campaigns are all parts of this growing landscape of resistance and resilience. These responses reflect a determination not only to survive, but also to assert agency, dignity, and belonging in the face of hostility. I think to take us deeper into these dynamics, we have invited an expert who is none other than Prof. Halim Rane from Griffith University Australia, introduce our speaker. Let me introduce our speaker briefly for our audience. Professor Halim Rane is a leading Australian scholar, internationally recognized for his contributions to understanding Islam and West relations, interreligious coexistence, and Muslim lived experiences across contemporary world. His research and teaching and community engagement have shaped scholarly public discourse on Islam in relations to security, human rights, and global justice. Professor Rane's interdisciplinary research explores the intersection of religion, politics, and international affairs with a focus on Islam and Muslims in both historical and contemporary context. On these issues, Professor Rane has published several important books, to name a few: Islam and Muslims in the West, Major Issues and Debates, Media Framing of the Muslim World, Conflicts, Crises and Context, Islam and Contemporary Civilization, Evolving Ideas and Transforming Relations, and also Reconstructing Jihad Amid Competing International Norms. And also another important book, Making Australian Foreign Policy on Israel and Palestine, Media Coverage, Public Opinion, and Interest Groups. And also, Professor Rane plays an active role in national and international engagement. He is also a founding executive member and the past president of Australian Association of Islamic and Muslim Studies. And we actually thank Associate Professor Dr. Halim Rane for accepting our invitation and join us with us today for this webinar. And before we invite Dr. Rane to give his lecture, let me share a few information about today's program. The speaker will present his ideas for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. Then we will open up the floor for Q&A comment session. The participants can ask directly by unmuting themselves, or they can share their questions and comments through writing in the chat box. So that's all from me. So this is now time to listen to our guest speaker. Without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Halim Rane. The floor is yours, sir.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Zaki, for the very flattering introduction and for the invitation to come and speak in this forum. Thank you to the Center and thank you to IIUM. I'm, of course, a graduate of International Islamic University, Malaysia. I was there in the 90s and graduated in 98. And I have very fond memories, obviously, of IUM, and inshallah, I look forward to visiting again soon. Okay, so today's presentation is about Muslim minorities in the age of far-right extremism, threats, resistance, and resilience. So just a bit of an overview of what I'll talk about this evening. I'll begin by addressing a few key concepts. I'll talk about Muslim minorities to give us a sense of the numbers of Muslim minorities in different parts of the world. I'll talk a little bit about the concept of extremism to define what we mean by extremism, and then specifically far-right extremism. And then we'll move into the key parts of the presentation tonight, the threats. We'll look at white nationalist or white supremacist far-right, but also other forms of far-right extremism, such as Zionism and Hinduva as well. Then we will move into the issue of resistance, and we'll look at some social and legal advocacy that is happening in the West. I'll use Australia as a case study for pushing back against far-right extremism and addressing some of the harms that are arising from far-right extremism. And then I'll talk a little bit about education and awareness and how important that is in terms of responding to far-right extremism. When we get to the resilience part of tonight's presentation, I'll be talking about something that's maybe familiar to some people, maybe a little bit more unfamiliar to others, and that is the concept of covenants in the Quran and Sunnah, the concepts of ahad and mithaq that we find in the Quran and Sunnah. and how a revival of this idea of covenants in Islam could be very beneficial in terms of our resilience uh, in our response to far-right extremism, but more importantly, for building connections between people, building a better understanding about Islam, and more peaceful coexistence between people on the planet. So just to begin with a little bit about Muslim minorities, about 80% of the world's Muslims live in a Muslim majority context. About 20% of the world's Muslims live as a minority. Usually these minorities are found in what we call European or Western countries, although we do have significant minorities of Muslims in China, for example, in India as well. But generally, when we think about Muslim minorities, we often think about Muslim minorities in the West, though their numbers are probably don't constitute the largest proportion of that 20% of Muslims that live in as a minority. But so if we go through the list here, sort of in ascending order, the United States population, about 1% of the population are Muslim in the United States. That's according to a 2017 Pew Research estimate. It's probably a little bit higher now. New Zealand, similarly, about 1%. Then when we get into Scandinavian countries like Norway, for example, it's around 3%. Australia, similarly, is around 3%. Though I can say, this is based on the 2021 census data. I can say anecdotally, we estimate that number to be quite a bit higher because the question on the census about religion is not compulsory, and so many people will neglect to or opt not to say their religion, and so it could be as much as 5% of Muslims in Australia, for example. So the statistics say there's about 800,000. It's probably closer to 1 million, I would imagine. Spain has about 4.5, maybe 5% Muslim. Italy about 5%. Canada about 5%. Sweden about 5% as well. United Kingdom starts to get a little bit higher, 6%. Netherlands 6%. Germany estimates range from 6 to 7%. Again, could be higher. France about 10% by some estimates. Belgium is another example where the population is about 10%. So there's a number of countries in Europe where there is, you could say, a significant minority of Muslims and a growing number of Muslims. It's also important to keep in mind that when we look at a lot of these Western countries, Islam is the fastest growing religion in these countries as well. So while the percentage of Muslims as a percentage of the population might be small, it's important to note that there's a significant growth rate of Muslims in these countries, and usually Islam is the largest non-Christian religion in most Western countries. Then we have some other examples of Muslim minorities, such as in India, for example, where it's 14 or 15% of the population. Now that's taken from census data from 2011, so you would imagine that it's significantly higher than that now. So it could be 15%, perhaps higher. Israel as well has a significant Muslim minority population of around 18 or 20%. So just to give us a bit of a snapshot of where we find Muslim minorities and the numbers in which we find them. So now moving on to this concept of extremism. When we talk about extremism, when we use the term extremism, we're talking about a deviation from the norm. So we could talk about extremism on the basis of what is socially normative, what is religiously normative, what is legally normative, and where we see groups or organizations or societies moving away or deviating from that norm, we may classify that as extremism. Where that extremism involves violence, we refer to that as violent extremism. Some of the characteristics that we find associated with extremism include supremacism, the idea that a particular group of people are superior to another group of people. I think from an Islamic perspective, we should think about this concept of supremacism as having satanic origins. If we think about the verses of the Quran that talk about when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Adam, he asked the angels, he commanded the angels to prostrate to Adam, and they did, and Iblis refused. And when Iblis refused, it's very interesting to take note of the dialogue in the Quran when Allah said, why did you refused to prostrate when I commanded you, the reply of Iblis at the time was, Ana khayrun minhu, I'm better than him. Khalaqtani min nar wa khalaqtahu min tin. You created me from fire and you created him from clay. So immediately Allah has informed us in the Quran that the shaitan is our avowed enemy. This was the covenant between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Prophet Adam that you can read about, for example, in Surah Taha, verses 115 to 117. And also if you read in uh, Surah Yasin, verse 60, Allah talks about the covenant with humanity to warning us and having us recognize that Shaitan is our avowed enemy. So Allah's giving us this dialogue in relation to the Shaitan so that we can know our enemy. So from this, when he says, you made me from fire and you made him from clay, that what the Shaitan is doing is he's making a distinction between himself and another creation of Allah on the basis of physical characteristics. When we know from the Quran, Allah says that the differences between people are based on our taqwa, not based on our color, our languages, and our Allah made us into nations and tribes so that we can know one another. And the most noble of us is the one who's has the most taqwa. But the shaitan is basing this on physical characteristics. And so if you think about in human history, the suffering of human beings has come from situations like slavery, like colonialism, like genocide, wars and conflicts. Generally, in these circumstances, we find one group of people claiming superiority, claiming supremacy over another people, whether it's based on color, I'm black, you're white, I'm this tribe, you're that tribe, I'm this nation, you're that nation. So this idea of making distinctions among ourselves based on some kind of physical characteristic is from the shaitan. And this is what we read in the Quran. So another key characteristic of the extremist is they're paleogenic. They're looking to recreate some kind of imagined glorified past, imagined golden past. They're extremists are intolerant and they usually have zero-sum politics. They want all the gains and they're who they see as opponents to have complete loss. They're not about a win-win. They're about dominating over the other groups in society. They use violence quite habitually in their ideology. Aggressive militancy is a characteristic of extremists. They, in fact, glorify violence. They're homogenous, meaning that they will stick to their own. The only people part of the in-group are those who are regarded as identifying with the ideology. This could be on racial grounds, it could be on a particular belief or ideological system, but they're exclusionary in the way they operate. They're opposed to diversity. When they get into power, generally they will have authoritarian type rule, even totalitarian type rule. We see with extremists, they tend to be opposed to democracy and they tend to be opposed to human rights. They often utilize religion, but when we look at the kinds of ways they use religion, they have irrational beliefs, and they claim to have a monopoly on the truth. So they're very unwilling to listen to the views of others. And so you can see that a lot of these characteristics relate back to this idea of supremacism. When we talk about far-right extremism, we're essentially talking about a political ideology or movement. Again, a key characteristic of far-right extremism is racial supremacy. Generally speaking, when we see far-right movements, there tends to be a racial basis for this. They tend to be ultra-nationalist. This is claiming control, sovereignty, authority over a state to the exclusion of other groups in society. And this, we see this in Western states, often comes at the expense of the indigenous people that, you know, one could rightly argue have the greatest claim to a nation. But you know, this power or authority has been usurped by the you know, the far right extremists, the supremacist group. They tend to be quite exclusivist, as we mentioned before, authoritarian, anti-democratic. one of the key characteristics of far-right extremism historically has been anti-Semitism. Um, they've long been opposed to Jewish people. But what we see, particularly post 9/11, after 2001, we see changes taking place in the profile or the characteristics of far-right extremists. Many of them are still retain their anti-Semitism, but what we see more prominently with many of them, I would say perhaps even most of them, is an anti-Islam sentiment. They're Islamophobic, they're anti-Islam, anti-Muslim. The other key characteristic that we're seeing more prominently among far-right extremist groups is their anti-immigration. So in Western countries, particularly, they tend to be very much opposed to policies of multiculturalism and policies, to allow immigrants into the countries. Um, One of the key theories that we see among propagated by far-right extremists is this a great replacement theory that emerged out of France around 2010. But you can see this as an ideology that's adopted by, or a theory that's adopted by far-right extremists, quite, globally. The basic idea is that the white race is being outpopulated by immigrants, blacks, Muslims, Arabs, essentially non-white people, losing control over their own countries. They're being replaced demographically and culturally by immigrants. And so this is the idea of the great replacement. They're being replaced by immigrant people. Some of the key ideologies that we see associated with far-right extremism include fascism and Nazism, and then their kind of more recent variants, neo-fascism, neo-Nazism. But far-right extremism is not just confined to Western countries, and I'm going to go through a few examples of the different far-right groups in Western countries, but we should also note that many scholars would argue that Zionism, particularly in its current manifestation, is another form of far-right extremism because of these reasons: racial supremacy, ultra-nationalist, authoritarian, Islamophobic, anti-immigrant. I mean, Palestinians can't go back to their homeland in Palestine, but Jewish people can come from anywhere in the world and and settle. Um, Hinduva is another ideology or movement that is often regarded as a far right movement as well, also displaying similar characteristics about excluding the peoples of India who are not regarded as part of this in group, what they would regard as the real Indians, the followers of Hinduism, to the exclusion of Muslims, of Sikhs, of Christians in the country. So let's move on to the concept of threat. When we use the term threat, what we're talking about is a statement, an action, or situation that indicates the possibility of harm, danger, or adverse consequences to a person, a group, an organization, or a system. Some of the most extreme examples of far-right extremism, or we could say terrorism, that we've witnessed, over the past few decades, begins with this person here, Anders Breivik. He killed 77 people in Norway in terrorist attacks in Oslo in 2011. He wrote this manifesto. It's like a 1,500-page manifesto. In there, he goes on. I mean, his main issue and his main focus is not anti-Semitism. It's actually anti-Islam. It's actually Islamophobic. And in there, he talks about the history of the last 1,400 years has been an Islamic jihad against non-Muslims. He talks about the essential aim of what he's doing. His attack was to prevent historical amnesia by preserving this true uncensored history as he describes it. And he says that since the creation of Islam in the 7th century up to this day, the Islamic Jihad has systematically killed more than 300 million non-Muslims, tortured and enslaved more than 500 million individuals. Of course, this is not historically accurate at all, but these are the kinds of reinvention of history, you know, rewriting of history without any real factual basis for any of this, that we see from the far right. You know, these claims about Islam being a religion of inherently a religion of violence, and a religion that is inherently hostile or sees non-Muslims as enemies. This, of course, you know, is completely incorrect. Any of us that have read the Quran and understand the Sunnah would reject this. But he's really appealing to an audience that has very low level of religious literacy when it comes to Islam. And you can also notice one thing about his manifesto, for example, is the use of Christian symbolism. And we see that with a number of different far-right groups in the West, is this utilization of Christian symbolism, even claiming to represent Christianity in some cases. Brenton Tarrant was inspired by Anders Breivik. Brenton Tarrant he was actually Australian born. He committed these terrorist attacks in Christchurch in New Zealand. He went at the time of Jummah prayer and opened fire on the congregation, killing 51 people and injuring many dozens more. This is in Christchurch in New Zealand in 2019. In his manifesto, he praises Anders Breivik, who regards him as a knight for their cause, and he talks about Islamic nations in particular have high birth rates, regardless of race or ethnicity, and in this there was anti-Islamic motivation to the attacks that he committed, as well as a want for revenge against Islam for the 1300 years of war and devastation that is brought on the people of the West and to other peoples around the world. So again, you see them making up this history. It doesn't have it's not based on fact or any evidence. So there's this invention of history of Islam being a religion of violence, that a religion that has historically targeted and persecuted non-Muslims. You can see from his statements in his manifesto as well that he's drawing on this idea of the Great Replacement theory, that because of the high birth rates of Muslims in Western countries, they are replacing non-Muslims and Christians, in particular white citizens of the country, and eventually these places will be no longer places for white Christians, is what he's trying to argue. And it's predicated on this idea that Islam is inherently hostile towards non-Muslims, inherently hostile toward Christianity, and that Islam is opposed to coexistence with non-Muslims. So again, you see this very, you know, a lack of religious literacy when it comes to understanding of Islam. There's been lots of studies done on these particular terrorists. One particular study that I think is important is Max Harwood's Living Death, the Imagined History of the Tarrant Manifesto. That was in a journal called Emotions, History, Culture, and Society. So Harwood does an analysis of Anders Breivik and Brenton Tarrant's manifestos for this study. And his conclusions are, I think, quite important. I'll just mention them here briefly. He says both referred to a history of aggression from Islam towards non-Muslims and their replacement by Muslim immigrants today. Their view of Islam significantly contributed to their pathway to terrorism. And he also says that while the personal journey of both terrorists' radicalization differed, it is nevertheless evident that in both manifestos that a mutual hatred of Islam preceded and drew both men to the digital political collective of the replacement theory of white supremacy. So again, this great replacement theory, white supremacy, is very closely linked to their anti-Islam rhetoric and sentiments. So I'll just go through quickly just to give you just a brief sort of mention of some of the main far-right groups we find in different Western countries. In Australia, the United Patriots Front, the True Blue Crew, Reclaim Australia, the Lads Society are some of those that you find. Now, the ones I've highlighted in red are the ones that use Christian symbolism, or they draw on Christian religion, or they try to position themselves as representative of Christianity, or as Christians. But you'll notice that from the characteristics of these particular groups, they're very anti-immigrant and they're anti-Muslim are their main sort of characteristics. In Germany, you've got the AfD, Combat 18, the Identitarian movement, and the Der Reiche group as well. Again, these are all, of course, far right groups, militant, Nazi oriented, but another key characteristic is anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim is another key characteristic of these groups here. And again, the ones I've highlighted in red draw on Christian symbolism, or try to represent themselves as Christians or defenders of a Christian West or a Christian Europe or a Christian Germany. In Britain, you've got the English Defence League, Britain First, National Action, For Britain. Now, this is not, of course, an exhaustive list. There are many other groups in all of these places. But again, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim, and at least for the first three, the EDL, Britain First, and National Action, they draw on Christian symbolism and represent themselves as defenders of Christianity against a perceived threat from Islam. In the United States, you've got groups like the Proud Boys, and you find Proud Boys in Australia as well. So many of these groups are not just in these particular countries, but they are transnational. Probably the oldest and the most famous one in the United States is the Ku Klux Klan. You've got Oath Keepers, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the National Socialist Movement. Again, these are neo-Nazi groups, of very strong anti-immigrant stance. And also, they're anti-Semitic in the United States as well, but they have an anti-Islam, anti-Muslim stance as well. So over to India. In India, the movement that we see associated with the current government in India is the Hindutva ideology, which literally refers to Hinduness or Hindu identity. But we have to note that with all of these ideologies, like the other far-right groups we've just mentioned, though they claim to be representative of Christianity, they're of course distinct from the religion. So we have to always make a clear distinction between the religion and the ideology. So Hindutva is the ideology, distinct from Hinduism, the religion. You've got various parties like the RSS, the VHP, and of course the uh, 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 BJP in India. The Hindutva ideology rests on this idea of Hindu Rashtra, or the Hindu nation. So India is fundamentally seen as Hindu in culture, in history, in identity. What we're seeing here is an ethno-religious nationalism and a promotion of Hindu supremacism. It's exclusionary in its identity politics, thereby marginalizing the other religious minorities in India, including Christians, Muslims, Sikhs, and others. Like other far-right groups, it's militant. The RSS, for example, operates quasi-militia, training and indoctrinating youth. It's anti-pluralism. It's intolerant, particularly of the minority groups. That you see violent mobilization, including mob lynchings, pogroms, vigilante violence, and you're probably familiar with many of these cases that have occurred with destruction of mosques, attacking Muslim businesses, attacking churches, this sort of thing as well. Like other far-right groups, the Hindutva uses censorship, arrests, bans, so they use the institutions of the state to oppress and repress the the minority groups in the country. There's a certain populism associated with the Hindutva, claiming to be the voice of the real Indians, and the real Indians, of course, means the Hindus. Uh, Again, like other far-right groups, like we saw with Brenton Tarrant and Anders Breivik, these far-right terrorists, there's historical revisionism going on. It's glorifying in a Hindu civilization, a Hindu past, and it's playing down the contributions that Muslims made historically to India, in fact, demonizing those periods of Muslim rule. And we can see global parallels. When we look at Hinduva, we can see it's a similar ideology with the far right groups that we find in Europe, Australia, the United States, and elsewhere. When we speak of Zionism, um, we're talking about the late 19th century settler colonial movement. It's ethno-nationalist as well, a sort of a racial religious supremacy. So Jews have rights that Palestinians don't have, though they are the indigenous people of the land. I'm just going to move through a little bit more quickly now because I realize that we're, you know, running a little short of time, although we probably only started around 10 past, perhaps, or I only started around 10 past. So maybe I'll go for another 10 minutes if that's okay. Dr. Zaki, would that be all right?
Yeah. You can continue.
Great, thank you. So let's talk about resistance. Uh, Resistance is the act or power of opposing, withstanding, or working against something, such as injustice, oppression, or an external force. In Australia, for example, um, if you look at the various religious groups in Australia, the most negatively regarded is Muslims. In fact, if you look at negative sentiments or attitudes towards different religious groups in Australia, Muslims is 4 times higher than that of other groups, though that has been reducing over time. At one stage, we had about 40% of the population held Islamophobic or negative views towards Muslims. That is reducing now down to 30, down to about 25%. But we can see that the influence of the far right is quite prominent and prevalent in Australia. Some studies have indicated that up to about maybe 70% of the Australian population has some level of Islamophobic views, in that they are concerned about the presence of Muslims, or they regard Islam as being a religion that is inherently hostile or has enmity towards non-Muslims. So groups like the Islamophobia Register Australia and the AMAN, the Australian Muslim Advocacy Network, are very important in conveying to the wider society what Islam is actually about. So there's awareness, literacy, raising levels of religious literacy or knowledge about the religion. But in particular, the Islamophobia Register records incidents of Islamophobic attacks, whether they be verbal, whether they be physical attacks, whether they be acts of vandalism, hate crimes, and so forth, whether that be online or in person. And so the latest report came out this year looking at the last 2 years of Islamophobia in Australia. Amman does a lot of work lobbying government, ensuring there's better racial discrimination laws or protections against hate speech and racial discrimination and those sorts of issues. So trying to tackle the negative consequences of far-right extremism in society. So this is some of the social and legal advocacy that is being done. But of course, education is very important. I would say the two most effective ways of addressing the consequences or the harms caused by far-right extremism is through education and interaction. The more people get to know each other, the more effective these other measures are in terms of reducing people's negative stereotypes and hostile attitudes. So when we look, there's some studies that have been done by Halifoff and Kim and Burma that have looked at the value of educating school students, for example, giving them information about different religious groups, giving them an appreciation for multiculturalism, an appreciation for the diversity of cultural and religious groups in society, thereby sort of insulating them, if you like, making them less vulnerable to propaganda from far-right groups. So this is a way of protecting people, minimizing the possibility they may be vulnerable to extremism. Others such as Rabasa, from the Rand Corporation, have also spoken about the importance of education. This particular quote is actually directed at who she regards as Islamist extremists, saying that you can dissuade Islamist extremists from their extremism and militancy by giving them better knowledge or information about Islam, noting that many people who engage in extreme Muslims who engage in extremism often have a demonstrating a low level of knowledge or understanding of Islam. But we could also use this point to say, better education about Islam for people who might be engaged in far right ideology is going to be very effective as well. There's even been a judge in the UK where this young person was arrested and brought before the courts for his violent extremism. He had downloaded bomb making websites from the internet, and he also had a lot of white supremacist documents and so forth. But instead of putting him into prison, what the judge in this particular case said is to read literature, basically to extend your cultural intellectual horizons so you don't think about people so in such ill-informed or such ways where have these biases and are vulnerable to the ideas of extremist groups. And so what he's indicating is education is a way of addressing these kinds of extremist ideas. So let's come to the last point now, which is resilience, the ability to withstand, adapt to, and recover from adversity, stress, or trauma. Um, I think what's very important is a narrative. How do we tell what we are about? Think about this. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It's increasing at twice the rate of any other religion or group on the planet. So by the latter half of this century, there's going to be more followers of Islam than followers of any other religion. So what will we stand for? How will we represent ourselves? At the moment, we've got this misinformation and stereotypes and propaganda floating around that Islam is inherently hostile to or sees non-Muslims, Christians as an enemy. This, of course, is not true if we, have a proper and thorough reading of the Quran and an understanding of the Sunnah. So, narrative is to information what information is to data. So we have data, and when we analyze that data, we get information. When we put information into a sequence and explain the relationship between those bits of information, we get a narrative. And so what we really need is a better narrative to explain to people, particularly in our, as Muslim minorities, to explain to the majority what Islam is really about. Because remember, there's been a quarter of a century of negative, propaganda about Islam since 9/11, 2001. What Western media and what many Western politicians have propagated is the idea of Islam as violent and that Islam sees non-Muslims inherently as an enemy. So we need counter or alternative narratives. The Quran itself is probably one of the most is probably the most important source that we have. We have verses of the Quran that talk directly about the protection of non-Muslim places of worship, of biyah, sawami, and salawat, churches, monasteries, and synagogues. We know that the Prophet ﷺ had very good relations with Christians. For example, Bahira the monk is in our hadith literature that Khadija's cousin, Waraka bin Nawfal, was the person she brought him to when he received the first revelation of the Quran. When his followers were being persecuted in Makkah, he sent them to the Aksum Negus al-Najashi in Abyssinia or modern-day Ethiopia. The Prophet clearly had good relations with Christians. The Constitution of Medina is a profound example of a document that brings all of the city's inhabitants together as one community. And this included Arabs and non-Arabs, Jews, Muslims, non-Muslims, all bound together by a single commitment to defend the city with various rights and obligations. And recognizing that people of different religious backgrounds and different ethnicities and so forth can coexist peacefully with one another in a single community or society. And then we come to the covenants of the Prophet. This is something that I think people know less about, but as the Prophet established the Constitution of Medina, he established the covenants with Christian, Jewish, and other communities outside of Medina. So this is an extension of his policy in Medina, where he pledged to protect Christian, Jewish, and other communities, their wealth, their property, their places of worship. And this is all, of course, consistent with the Quran. So a covenant is essentially a solemn agreement, a bond or a commitment or a pledge. Um, when we look at covenants in the Quran and Sunnah, we're talking about the, this commitment that is, or this agreement, this acknowledgement that is fundamental to the relationship between Allah and humanity and between human beings. Essentially, covenants establish the terms and conditions for human existence and coexistence. And covenants, of course, have been used by people all throughout human history. Look at various First Nations people here in Australia, the Native Americans, Native people of other places. Look at all the different religions, including Islam. Look at the different civilizations. People from time immemorial have used covenants to establish peace, to build relations between communities, and to maintain peace between people. If we look at the Quran, we can see that in some very fundamental sections of the Quran, we see reference to covenants. Like, for example, in Surah Mu'minun, where it talks about the characteristics of a believer, covenants are written right there, like those who fulfill their covenants. If we look at in Surah Al-Baqarah 177, where it talks about the characteristics of a righteous person, one who fulfills their covenants is part of what it means to be righteous. In fact, if we go through the Quran, more extensively, we can see these concepts of ahad and mithaq extensively used in the Quran. And we see them used in all of the key relationship categories between Allah and humanity, between Allah and the prophets, between Allah and the different peoples, including the Bani Israel, for example, between Allah and the Christians, and also between Allah and the people of the Prophet Muhammad's time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We also see covenantal terms used in relation to family and in relation to spouses. In Surah Nisa, for example, verse 21 talks about a solemn covenant between the husband and wife. So we can see, in addition to the Constitution of Medina and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Prophet ___ established the covenant with the monks of Mount Sinai, covenant with the Christians of Najran, covenant with the Bani Israel, covenant with the Magi as well, and quite a number of others actually. I don't have time to go into detail, but here is a translation of the Prophet's covenant with the monks of Mount Sinai. You can find this in the monastery in Mount Sinai in St. Catherine Monastery. You can see the very same document preserved in the very famous Turkish book Munsharat Salitin, which was written by Feridun Bey in the time of Sultan Murad III, which is in the late 1500s. And so, you can see that a document like this has been preserved by Muslim officials, qadis, and sultans over time. But clearly what we see from this document is the Prophet is pledging protection to Christians, to protecting their churches, protecting their property, protecting their lives. And that anyone who breaks this is in fact breaking the covenant with Allah. When we look at the covenants and analyze them, the covenants of the Prophet, we can see that they are consistent with the Quran, like that there is no compulsion in religion, the protection of churches, monasteries, and synagogues and mosques. That in the Quran, the Prophet is told he can't compel people to accept the religion. In other verses of the Quran, like 18:29, for example, Allah says if Allah wanted to make everyone believe, he would believe. If he wanted to make everyone disbelieve, he would make them disbelieve. Of course, in Surah Kafirun, lakum dinakum waliyadin, unto me my way, unto you yours. So clearly, people can believe or disbelieve. It's up to them. If we look at some of the studies that have been done of early Christian writings, those Christians that came under Muslim rule, translations from Syriac, we can clearly see they're referring to the covenants of the Prophet that gave them this protection, and they regarded this as a period of justice and protection. And I'll just very briefly go through just to talk about some recommended reading. There's been quite a lot of research done over the past decade or so on covenants in the Quran, and these are some of the studies, including some of those that I've authored as well. But the work of Joseph Lombard is a very important one. The work of Professor Louay Safi, those of you from IUM will probably know Louay Safi, are very important works on covenants in the Quran. And then, of course, we have some really important works on covenants in the Sunnah. So this includes this particular book written by Professor Ibrahim Zain. Many of you from IUM, of course, will know Professor Zain. He was one of our professors. And he wrote this book with Ahmed al-Wakil, analyzing these covenants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, including the covenant with the Christians of Najran, the covenant with the monks of Mount Sinai, and some others as well. So demonstrating the historicity and the authenticity of these covenants. So just to quickly conclude now, far-right extremism combines a resurgent nationalism, anti-immigration, Islamophobia, which is fueled by fears of cultural and demographic change, particularly the increase in numbers of Muslims around the world, including in the West. Some far-right extremists claim allegiance to Christianity and use it as a symbolic tool to promote these notions of a Christian or Western civilization. The movement is, of course, diverse and decentralized, with groups and individuals engaged in violent extremism, terrorism, and often this is directed at Muslims and Islam, and increasingly so, actually. Education, social, and legal advocacy can be very effective in countering far-right extremism and holding extremists and terrorists accountable, including through legal means, which is very important through legislation. Covenants are central to the universal human story and fundamental to the Quran and Sunnah, particularly to the God-human and interhuman relations. Covenants in Islam establish the terms and conditions, the expectations and obligations, the rights and responsibilities for human existence and coexistence, as well as the necessary foundations for accountability to Allah and to each other, because we have to coexist. They give us certainty about our life in this world and in relation to the hereafter, and they establish the important trust as well. Covenants in the Quran and Sunnah establish a normative Islamic tradition and provide a powerful narrative of human security and peaceful coexistence in Islam, which of course is a very important counter narrative to the claims made by the far-right extremists. Okay, so I'll conclude there, and hopefully we've got a little bit of time for questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Professor Halim Brane, for your wonderful and very thought-provoking presentation. And now it's time for the Q&A session. Already we have a few questions here. And
Okay.
Professor Daniel Yusuf is from IIUM. He's the director of Peace and Dialogue and Xenophobia Studies Center. He asks that are ethno-nationalisms ultimately supremacist ideologies? Aside from Zionism and far-right extremism, he brings the Malay Arab nationalisms uh, share the same side of the same other side of the same coin, he asks.
Malay Arab nationalism as a
Arab
form of
nationalism,
far-right
yeah.
extremism. It hasn't come up on my radar as an example of that. I couldn't speak to that. I couldn't say so. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the kinds of groups that I've referred to are engaged in violent extremism, attacking people, denying people their rights, causing destruction, causing harm. I haven't studied the Malay Arab nationalism to be able to comment on that. Yeah.
Mm, okay. There are other two questions. What kind of policies can protect Muslim minorities from hate crimes and political discrimination? This is one. How can media, education, and public discourse improve the perception of Muslim minorities? So two
Yeah.
questions from
Yeah,
Khadir.
that's a great question. Media are responsible for the perpetuation of a lot of the negative stereotypes and misinformation about Islam. In fact, the way the media for the last 25 years have represented Islam and Muslims is to put terrorists and criminals as kind of the representatives of Islam. They've portrayed Islam as a religion of violence because they've covered Islam in context of extremism, violence, terrorism. And so for non-Muslim people who don't really know much about the religion, although understanding and awareness of the religion is growing, I might add, and conversion to Islam is growing a lot as well. But for a lot of people, They rely on the media for this information, and because the media have acted irresponsibly, there is a perpetuation of these negative stereotypes and fertile ground for far-right extremism to grow, actually. Coming to that first question there about um, the legal side of it, it's very important for advocacy groups to use the existing laws in these particularly Western countries. Western countries tend to have good laws that protect human rights and democratic principles and those sorts of things, and to afford various groups, including religious minority groups, the right to practice their faith, the right to protection from hate crimes and from hate speech and that sort of thing. So it's a matter of holding politicians accountable so that those laws are upheld and preserved and are not watered down or set aside when Muslims are involved. I mean, one of the great tragedies that we've witnessed over the past almost 2 years now is the setting aside of international law, in the case of essentially allowing Israel to act with impunity towards the Palestinian people. So we have, the Genocide Convention, and we have, other legal means by which, none of these atrocities should have been able to happen. But, Western countries often get away with violations of international law and are not held accountable by the ICJ or the ICC in the same way that other international actors are. So it's about um, recognizing that Western countries do have very strong democratic and human rights legislation, and ensuring that they uphold those laws in the case of or where Muslims and Arabs and others are concerned.
Thank you. Yeah.
Um, I have a question. Can you
Yeah,
hear me?
yeah. Go
Okay.
ahead. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. Could you give an example of how covenants in this day and age could be useful for people to understand more and have better relations with Muslims?
Brilliant. Thank you for that question. It's very important. If I might just go to a foundational point, and that is what is the significance of covenants in our religion, in Islam? If you think about this, Allah is a just and merciful Lord. So, and if you think about our life on earth, it's quite a short period, right? And the Quran says that when we're in the afterlife, it'll seem like we were here for a day or half a day, or a very short period of time. It's fleeting. And so if you think about it, this very short experience that we have, for us, it's 50, 60, 70, 100 years maybe. But in the afterlife, it'll seem so much briefer than that. So it's a very high stakes situation we're in. We have this short experience, and then we have an eternity of either Jannah or Jahannam. So the stakes couldn't be higher. And Allah, being a just and merciful Lord, is not going to leave us in a situation where the stakes are so high and we don't know what the rules are of the situation we're in, right? So Allah is informing us through the covenants of the terms and conditions, our rights and responsibilities, expectations and obligations. And if you look at the way covenants are discussed in the Quran, they intersect with other very key concepts in the Quran. So ahad and mithaq intersect with the concept of adl, of justice, of the concept of rahmah, mercy, of the concept of taqwa, righteousness, with the concept of amana, the trust that Allah has given us as Khalifa on the earth. So all of these things intersect. And so the importance of the covenant is, and it begins with the primordial covenant where Allah assembled all of took from the loins of Adam all of the people who would eventually be, you could say, assembled our souls, you could say, in a pre-earthly state, and asked us, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And the collective reply of humanity was Bala Shahidna. We recognize this. So we recognized the lordship of Allah and our accountability to Allah. Then, if you look at the covenants related to the prophets, so as we acknowledged Allah, the prophets are acknowledging that the revelation that they're receiving is from Allah, and they're acknowledging their responsibility to convey the message as Allah has willed it to be conveyed to the people. So the promise, so in us acknowledging Allah, the commitment Allah has given back to us, putting us on the earth, is that we will be provided with guidance. And one of the other key covenants in all of this is the shaitan is your avowed enemy. Allah made this covenant with Prophet Adam and made this covenant with humanity as well. Because if you think about what the shaitan's objective is to deceive, to tempt, to turn us away from Allah, and to make us suffer. And if you think about all the suffering that happens on earth through war, through conflict, through alcoholism and gambling, and all of these kinds of vices, comes from the shaitan. And that's made very clear to us in the Quran. And this idea of supremacism comes from the shaitan as well. And if you think of the wars, the conflicts, the genocide, the colonialism, the slavery, all of this was founded on this idea of supremacism, a group of people thinking they're better than another group and able to oppress them or justified oppressing them. This idea came from the shaitan. And Allah countered this very clearly in the Quran by saying that our languages and our colors, or the diversity in our languages and colors, is part of the ayatullah, it's the signs of Allah, and that none of us are superior to others other than through our taqwa. Yeah. So, I highly encourage everybody to read the Quran and now start to take note, particularly if you read in Arabic. Sometimes the translations are not picking up on the key term, but when you read in Arabic, look for these terms, ahad and mithaq, and then it'll give you a completely different perspective, and it'll give you a depth of insight that you may not have recognized before. If you just give me another minute to explain something else. Over the past 25 years, and perhaps probably longer, and you can see from the manifestos of these terrorists like Breivik and Tarrant, they're promoting this idea of Islam as a religion of violence. And this is something the mass media has done for 25 years, more than that even. And often they will talk about the sword verse of the Quran, 9:5 from Surah Tawbah. But if you read Surah Tawbah from the perspective of the covenant, what do you notice? The chapter starts by saying that the treaty is now annulled, talking about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. So the Prophet made a peace treaty with the non-Muslims. They broke the treaty. So Allah said now it's annulled. But if you keep reading through, while it says fight against those people after the sacred months are over, but it says keep the treaty with the ones who keep their treaty. Give protection to the ones who seek protection. Maintain your treaty with the ones who made the treaty at the Masjid al-Haram. So what is it telling us? Allah doesn't regard people monolithically, or Allah recognizes the diversity of groups of people, whether that's the Christians or the hypocrites or the munafiqeen or the polytheists, including those ones in relation to the treaty. It's not, even though the leaders of that broke their treaty, of course, not all the followers thought that that was a good idea. Human beings are not robots. We don't all think the same way. We have independent thoughts and feelings and perspectives and different conduct as well. That's why Allah said, fight against those who broke their treaty, but keep your treaty with ones who want to keep it, and give protection to those who seek your protection, recognizing the diversity of people. So this is not about people belief or unbelief. Allah accepts that some people are going to believe, some people are not going to believe. The importance of the covenant, and this comes to your question, what's the importance of it in this day and age, is that everybody should be protected from the hands of everybody else. And that's what covenants have always done historically, is to establish a commitment between people, an agreement. And the term mithaq refers to the binding agreement here, the bond between people, that we agree that we won't harm each other. And if you think about all the way through to the modern covenants, like the United Nations Charter and the International Bill of Human Rights, which consists of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant of social and economic rights, for example. All of this, the whole infrastructure of the rules-based international order is based on covenants. And the principles of these are consistent with our religion. because the fundamental idea here is believe or don't believe, it's up to you. But everybody must be safe and secure from the hands of everybody else so that we can live on this earth and worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in peace. If other people don't want to believe, that's up to them. But we should at least be safe from their hands and they should be safe from ours. And that's fundamentally what covenants are about: human security and peaceful coexistence. Human security is not just safety from bombs and bullets, it's about food security, it's about energy security, it's about the safety and security of our person, our families, our communities, our societies, our states. It's comprehensive. And so this is very much what Islam is about: human security and peaceful coexistence. And that's what the covenants aim to establish and maintain.
Well, thank you. There's a final question, and with that we conclude because the time is running out. There is a question that Siti Noor Adila asked. You have linked the resilience to Quranic and Sunnah principles, but in secular policy discourse, resilience is often instrumentalized to celebrate endurance while ignoring structural violence. Do you see a tension between Islamic ethic of resilience and how it is co-opted in state narratives that sidestep responsibility and things?
Hmm.
I think,
Um,
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understood the question, but I would say resilience, manifests in different ways. We have, like, if we look at the Palestinians in Gaza, for example, they are teaching us about resilience. They're going without, I mean, almost all of their homes have been destroyed. Almost all of their hospitals have been destroyed. All the mosques have been destroyed. All the churches have been destroyed. All the schools have been destroyed. All the universities have been destroyed. And still they continue. Still they survive. Uh, but by the will of Allah, may Allah make it easy for them and may Allah give them victory over those people who are oppressing them. But there's spiritual resilience on their part, there's physical resilience on their part. But we outside also need to be resilient in calling for an end to this conflict, in calling for justice, in calling for accountability. And so if you think about these concepts of justice, accountability, trust, these are all covenantal concepts as far as the Quran and Sunnah are concerned. And so maybe I'll just conclude by saying I highly encourage everybody to look at take a look at some of the scholarship that's been produced on covenants, particularly this book by Ibrahim Zain and Ahmad Al-Wakil on covenants of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And then, also, some of the work that I've done, like, for example, this article on human security and peaceful coexistence in Islam, or this other one that's open access, higher objectives, maqasid of covenants in Islam, which is a content analysis of ahad and mithaq in the Quran. I think this is a great starting point for people to get an understanding of covenants. It's not something that I learnt about when I was a student at IUM. I'm not sure if it's part of the curriculum now, but we need to make covenants part of our studies of Islam. It's there in the Quran extensively, and it's there in the Sunnah, and it's there when we study the history of Muslim governance. And I think we have to bring this to the attention of everybody in the world to counter these misinformation and misconceptions about Islam.
Mm. Oh, thank you, Prof. If you have time, just a final question. What are some best practices of Christian countries in promoting tolerance toward Muslims in Western and Eastern contexts? For example, he's asking how Christian communities are actually taking this issue seriously from their part.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, there's been quite positive reception to the studies of the covenants from different countries. We've been invited to the Vatican, to Rome, under the previous Pope, to present our research on the covenants. That they found it quite fascinating. I know Professor Ibrahim Zain has been. And Ahmed Al-Wakil have visited, many other countries as well, Greece, and they visited the monasteries there and so forth. Here in Australia, I've spoken to different church groups and so forth. The covenants have received a very good sort of attention. But Western countries as they stand do have these ideals of human rights and democratic principles and rights. I think the responsibility is to ensure that they continue to uphold them. And I think covenants are a very effective language that we can speak with various different religious groups. We can come to common understanding and common agreement about how we can coexist, because it's something that humans have always done historically, is to found our relationships and build our communities and establish peace with one another on the basis of covenants. And I think this is something that if we all develop a better understanding of it, I think this is a language and an instrument we can use to, um, resolve conflict and inshallah establish, peaceful coexistence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank
Justice.
you, Prof,
Yeah.
for your responses. And hopefully, I think the participants will take this final note seriously and continue to engage with this scholarship. And so it is time to wrap up. So I will again thank all the participants for joining with us today for this insightful webinar. And before we wrap up, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to the Professor Halim Brani, who shared with us some of his recent works and perspectives towards Muslim minority issues and also far-right extremism, Islamophobia. And also a big thank you for our audience for their engagement and thoughtful questions. And also, I would like to thank the head of the Policy and Area Studies Research Unit, Dr. Mir Alif, and the team for the arrangements. And finally, I would like to invite Prof. Halim to Malaysia as, within this year, hopefully.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Yeah, no, I hope to come. My intention is to come in November,
Oh,
the end of the year, inshallah. Yeah. Yeah.
inshallah,
Yeah.
I hope that
I miss it. I want to come back, inshallah. Yeah.
yeah. We hope to receive you and host you, inshallah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, we have in IIUM recently we established a research center on peace, dialogue, and xenophobia studies center. Yeah,
Saw
and
that. Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant.
we can we can host there, inshallah.
Yeah.
And
I'll when I know the dates I'm traveling, I'll let you know, and perhaps we can have some meeting or a talk or something there. It'd be great.
yeah, sure. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof, for your comments and ideas. And so with that note, I think we conclude for this. With that note, I conclude this webinar by reciting Dua al-Kafara. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Thank you very much, Prof, for your.
I mean,
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.